This is a book about, all of my books are about Kirk and Spock. I love the original series, it's my favorite. Hello friends, my name is Emily, I'm the Bi, and here are some books off of my bookshelf. So today I thought I would talk about adaptations and tie-ins, which is kind of one of my favorite genres of books, specifically adaptations and tie-ins to film and television. And I have a couple of examples in general, so I own a lot of them. And some of the ones I own are basically, adaptations of the script into book form. These are always fun because they use an earlier draft of the script to write the book, so like it's not always one for one. But because they're using the script and the acting hasn't happened yet, there's a little flourish going on. So depending on who wrote it, can be very fun. I also have a bunch of books that are adaptations of episodes as well, same premise, and then books that are just kind of like tie-ins in general. So these are some of my non-Star Trek adaptations and tie-ins, but today I thought I would use my Star Trek specific books to talk about the 4 kinds of adaptations and tie-ins that you will probably see as a person in the world who might be looking at them. The first thing you're probably going to see, or the first thing I really saw anyway, was adaptations of stories that already exist on film. So here I have the 2009 Star Trek reboot novelization, which was written by Alan Dean Foster. So these types of adaptations, especially if it is for a film, not just an episode of the TV show, will use an earlier version of the script because you have to get an earlier draft of the script to the novelist way before you actually start production and probably have even finished doing rewrites. It's basically like, here's a rough idea of what we're probably gonna do that. And so you will often find that if you read these or listen to them, I think Zachary Quinto did the audiobook for this one, which was super fun. But if you were to read this and watch the film, you'll find that a lot of times either big plot points, depending on how early they got the script, or just smaller plot points or dialogue exchanges, that kind of thing, are a bit different, either because it is from an older version of the script or because the novelist wanted, depending on how much ability they have to do this, to kind of extrapolate something more, to make scenes longer, to kind of delve into the feelings and emotions of all of the characters, especially because they haven't shot the film yet. So they might not really know exactly what the lean is gonna be and what the direction is gonna be, so, they take a little stab at it. Sometimes it works really well and sometimes it doesn't, but Alan Dean Foster is actually one of the best, and you'll see him a lot if you do like sci-fi, if you look at sci-fi adaptations. He also did the Force Awakens adaptation, which I love, and he's been doing a bunch of Star Trek and Star Wars stuff for a really long time. In fact, I think he did the original novelization of the first Star Wars film back in the day. So that is a film adaptation of a script. And then you have episodes of TV. These are adaptations of the script, and they do varying things. So, oh hello, from when I bought it. This is more like the Star Trek 2009 adaptation of the script, where this is a single episode of the original series of Star Trek, adapted by J.A. Lawrence, who is also a figure you'll see a lot if you look at Star Trek specifically, especially old Star Trek. Mud's Angels is an episode of the original series, I believe in season 1, and this is a pretty hefty adaptation of that, 50-minute, hour-long episode of Star Trek. Compare that to this section of pages right here between my fingers is the adaptation of The Enemy Within. These are still novelizations of episodes. That is what I would call them. However, they are also acting more like summaries with dialogue, if that makes sense. So these exist, but then this is also just like a novel. And you're like, cool, great. So those are the kinds of like, just straight up, we're adapting a story that already existed in the world that you'll probably see. So that's number 1. So the second kind of adaptation tie-in you'll see are tie-ins, which are books written in the universe, additional stories. That's what they are. So if you want to talk about the difference between Star Wars and Star Trek specifically, if we're gonna compare them, the difference, especially before Disney got their hands on Star Wars and Lucasfilms, was that Star Trek, nothing was canon. None of the additional books, none of this mattered, none of this was canon. The adaptations of episodes were barely canon, probably actually weren't, that kind of thing. It's just like, do whatever you want, we're having fun, which is kind of the Star Trek thing anyway. But Star Wars, every single book that was published pre-Disney era was considered canon. So there was like a large stranglehold on the kinds of stories that were happening and where stuff in the universe was going, which I think has its kind of ups and downs, the same as Star Trek not being canon at all has its kind of ups and downs. That's also a thing. It's like, I think all of the Veronica Mars tie-in books are technically canon, I'm pretty sure, but not every tie-in book in every series is actually going to be canon. I have some Doctor Who and Supernatural tie-in books that are definitely not canon, so it's like, really just depends on the series. In Star Trek, they are never canon, nothing is ever canon, do whatever you want, which is great. I think it's kind of freeing. But these are another type of book you're gonna come across when you're looking at adaptations and tie-ins. They're tie-ins. So here in my hands, I have The Vulcan Academy Murders by Jean Laura. So in this book, Kirk and Spock go to the Vulcan Academy Hospital to treat an Enterprise crew member, and Spock's mom is there, and then Kirk gets embroiled in family drama. There's like a murder that happens suddenly, and oh no, there's a murderer on Vulcan. Vulcan Academy Murders. Murder mystery, we love those. And then you have Strangers from the Sky, which I think is probably one of the most popular of all Star Trek tie-in books, because this is probably not the only book, but it is definitely one of the first books that deals with first contact. So this book goes back and forth between first contact with Vulcan, which is like an extremely interesting point in Star Trek history to me, which is why I always wanted this book and then I finally got it, and stuff that's going on with Kirk and Spock in the current time period. The Federation's gonna get destroyed. We gotta save it. So it's like the creation of the Federation and then like saving the Federation from destruction. Fun! And then we have my ultimate, this is my favorite Star Trek tie-in book, and I wish that there were sequels. I have one single complaint about it, which is like pretty big because it doesn't have my favorite character from all of Star Trek in it, and like, that's a lot. But I still love this book so much, and it is Star Trek Academy Collision Course, which was written by William Shatner, but also written by Judith and Garfield Reeves Stevens. So this is an alternate version of Kirk and Spock's time at the Academy. I love this. My one complaint is that McCoy isn't here, and he is my favorite Star Trek character, so like annoying. But this has a mystery in it, there's some romance, there's lots of stuff about Spock, so like if you're interested in Spock, the chapters go back and forth between Kirk and Spock and kind of what they're doing before they collision course together, as it were. This is great. I love this. So, tie-ins. New stories in the universe, whether they're connected to canon or not, are the second kind of book you're gonna see when you look up adaptations and tie-ins for your favorite intellectual property. Okay, so the next type of adaptation and tie-in you're likely to see with your favorite intellectual property, that is film or television, is definitely something you're not as likely to see as any of the others, but is so rewarding and is my absolute favorite. And that is books that are written as though they're in the universe. My example for this is going to be the Starfleet Technical Manual. This is probably one of my favorite thrift store finds, or like used bookstore finds, maybe ever. And it tickles me to look at it, and I knew that I needed it. So this is a manual that was originally published in, I believe, 75. So it was published after the original series went off air. I think this was part of the like revamp of like probably when the movies were coming out and like kind of renewing interest in Star Trek as a whole. This particular edition that I'm holding is from '86. It is the 20th anniversary edition of this, so it was republished in the late 80s. This is a manual, this is a book that has lots of diagrams, it has the Articles of Federation and the Articles of Peace, and it has literally everything you could probably need to know as a cadet, being on a starship in Starfleet, as it were, when Star Trek was on in the 60s. So like Gene Roddenberry's imagination of what being a cadet in Starfleet was like, being on a starship, this is the manual for you. It is truly like, it is fully written as though it is just for you if you were a cadet. It has the official colors of Starfleet, at least at the time. This is basically a really great resource for anyone who is a huge fan of Star Trek, but also if you want to write either Star Trek or want to write something like Star Trek, like write in a universe that's like Star Trek, these kinds of things, just like having show writing manuals, which I do have for Star Trek, are absolutely important for writers specifically, whether you're going to try to write for a TV show or a film that's like Star Trek, or if you're trying to write a book. Being able to see exactly how fleshed out the world is brutally amazing, truly. The other book in this category, which I do own but don't physically have with me right now, much to my internal pain, is the autobiography of James T. Kirk. This book was written by David A. Goodman, and he is kind of an authority in Star Trek in terms of writing books like this, writing these tie-in books, at least right now. So he wrote the Kirk one, he also wrote one on Picard, he's written one on Spock, he also wrote Star Trek Federation, which is a history of the first 150 years of Starfleet and the Federation as a whole, which, again, just like the manual, I think is probably an integral text if you're trying to like write either in the Star Trek universe or write a universe like Star Trek, trying to see the canon of how the universe has kind of built itself out. And so these are definitely my favorite types, both as a writer and also just as a person who wants more things from the world. I always want to know how technical things work in worlds, especially in sci-fi. And so these are bread and butter. Absolutely great. Love that for all of us. Okay, so the fourth type of adaptation and tie-in book to a TV show or film you're gonna see is gonna be nonfiction. So let's talk about that. There's definitely a couple of types of nonfiction, so there's lots of things that can fall into the nonfiction category. So I'm gonna show you a couple. I have this collection of essays, which is called Star Trek in History, and this is a series of essays written by people about, specifically I believe, TOS, and how history up to the point where TOS was written and then how we can extrapolate what it's done so far has kind of played into both how we see Star Trek and how we see the characters of Star Trek, and also how Star Trek was written in the first place and how it was imagined in the first place. So you have essays about like James T. Kirk as an Old West hero, what Star Trek means that space is the final frontier, that like it is a Western. There's an essay about Uhura and civil rights in space and space history, and like it talks about both Uhura as a character in Star Trek and then also what was happening in the United States at the time that Uhura was existing on our TV screens. And then there's an essay about my beautiful Dr. McCoy and medicine beyond machine, and that like while they use a lot of technology in Star Trek as part of like the medical thing, that like McCoy as a figure works beyond all of those things, which I just love. Beautiful. There's also an essay about how Star Trek technology in the show affected the way that we decided to go with technology now, that like pads in Star Trek and communicators helped kind of the people who were going to make cell phones and iPads and like, you know, tablets, those kinds of things, visualize what they could look like. And like Star Trek is kind of the reason that at the very least the things we have look the way they do. The next kind of book that you have is Meaning in Star Trek, which is a nonfiction book. It is about fandom specifically. So where Star Trek in History talks a little bit about fandom at the end and kind of talking about how obviously like talking about stuff like the technology is still talking kind of about the fandom of Star Trek. This talks very specifically about the fandom in Star Trek. It aims to answer the question, why was Star Trek the most popular series of all time? It is from '77, so it's definitely just the original series. I think it's probably either right after or right before the first or second films come out, so it's post the TV show ending, so we're able to kind of step back and look at what was it about Star Trek that drove so many women into the fandom. And then the other types of nonfiction you're gonna see are like making of books that are about what it was like to make stuff. It gives you the history of the production and, you know, interviews people who were working on it, either behind the scenes, in front of the camera, the creators, etc. It'll also usually give you behind the scenes photos that you probably wouldn't see anywhere else, or like seeing stuff from angles that you would never see stuff from, which I think is fascinating. This has like call sheets and shit. Like, this is a great resource. This is also just a book about the creation of Star Trek as well. It's like, this is the making of Star Trek and this is the world of Star Trek, but they're very clearly from the same family because they literally have the same font and the same like setup of everything. These are both wonderful resources. This is just about TOS. I think they were both published after the original series went off the air. This is from 73. This one is from, where's the fucking, this one doesn't have a fucking copyright page. Oh yes it does, 68. So this is actually, the making of Star Trek is from closer to when the show went off air, and then this is from after, which makes sense because the back of this book doesn't really say anything. It's just photos and some quotes. But this one actually has stuff on the back about the book, and one of the last sentences is, "The series may be off the air, but Star Trek lives for every one of its loyal fans. All those women." They demand it. So those are adaptations. There are usually 4 types of adaptations, tie-ins, that you're gonna see if you're looking into kind of expanding your world beyond the TV show or the movie that you're interested in. I use Star Trek as an example because it is my favorite. I own the most things from it. I think probably Star Trek and Star Wars are gonna be your most diverse in terms of hitting all 4 types of adaptation and tie-in. I really don't think many things have stuff like the books written as though they're from the world. Like the autobiography of James T. Kirk is written as though James T. Kirk wrote it. It is an autobiography after all. The Federation book is written as though it was written by historians from the future. Great. Fucking wonderful. I love that. So those are some examples. I really love adaptations and tie-ins, if you couldn't tell. And I just wanted to share that love and that kind of breadth of knowledge I have about, especially the books I already own, with you. So down below, let me know what your favorite adaptation or tie-in ever is. I would love to know. I love Star Trek so much, so if you have any other suggestions that aren't Star Trek, especially books written in universe of something, let me know. I'm dying to read them. Fascinating. They all go in this cubby if you couldn't tell. It's fucking wrecked.